thank you guys for having me. It was really cool to put this project together. Like my colleagues and I have spent 3 years on it. And when I first joined as a graduate student, I was kind of fresh out of university, didn't really know what to do. But I had a major in theology and I had a major in psychology, and there's this really cool opportunity to study the relationship between religion and mental health, especially in immigrant and minority communities. And so I'm excited to kind of share with you what we've put together. A lot of social science research frames religion and mental health with the word religiosity. And religiosity is just a word that we use to describe kind of adherence to religious practices and beliefs. So if somebody goes to church more often or goes to the temple more often, you'd say that they score higher in religiosity. And so religiosity, we know, is moderately associated with greater well-being, lower rates of depression and anxiety, and lower rates of suicide. But this often is related to the fact that they have kind of more close-knit communities. And so when you're struggling and you're a religious person, well, you typically reach out to your religious community. On the flip side, religiosity can lead to excessive feelings of guilt, fear, shame, and self-loathing, often because, well, religions have a strong moral component. And so if there's a part of your life that, doesn't exactly fit with your religion, this tends to make people feel extremely ashamed and actually isolates them from those same communities. And so in immigrant communities, this effect is extremely heightened. And this is especially true here in Canada. There's strong evidence that immigrants and minorities view their mental illness through a spiritual lens. And this usually happens through framing their symptoms with religious idioms of distress. So basically what happens is in a clinic, like a psychiatric clinic, or when an immigrant goes to see their therapist or psychologist, they'll often say that they're being, tormented by demons or something like that. So they frame their experiences of psychosocial difficulties through their religious lens. Because of this, they tend not to go seek out help from mental health professionals. So immigrants have been noted to avoid seeking out help from therapists, from psychiatrists, from clinicians. And sometimes this is because of attitudes within the culture, within the family, strong dissuasion, right? So we've seen people, for instance, say things like, in our family, we don't talk about mental health. Or if you're struggling with depression, you're mad, there's something wrong with you. And because of attitudes like this, people tend to not seek out help even though they really need it. And as opposed to that, what they tend to do is reach out to the church or their mosque or their temple. And so if they're struggling with depression, say, somebody in their family might tell them, you should go talk to the pastor or go talk to the priest. Maybe the priest can pray for you and you'll start to feel better, something like that. And so we kind of knew this about immigrants in Canada, but there was still a very under-researched phenomenon. So our goal as a research team was to explore the beliefs and experiences of religious minorities experiencing mental distress, and to focus on the role of religion and their religious clergy, so their pastors and priests and stuff, in their mental health recovery. So a kind of framework we use, this is like Arthur Kleinman. He's a medical anthropologist, and we rely on him very heavily when we study mental health service uses at McGill. And he broke up mental health service utilization into 3 categories. The first is the professional. So this is like anywhere that medicine is offered as a professional service. So if you go to your doctor, that's an example of professional healthcare. And this isn't necessarily just Western medicine, right? So if there's like Ayurvedic medicine from the Eastern world, that would still count as a professional service. Anywhere people reach out to a professional for health services, that would fit under the professional category. The second category is the popular category. And this is when somebody asks their family or friends for advice about, who should I go see when I'm struggling? Now, one of the interesting things is that 80 to 90% of healthcare decisions happens in the popular sector. So basically, the most consequential factor when it comes to what people choose to do with regards to their struggles is what the people around them are telling them to do. And so people, family, community, these are highly, highly influential. Now, the third sector is the folk sector. And this is where you see things like spiritual healing, kind of religious modalities of healing, herbal medicine. And when you're working with immigrant communities, this is something that you have to familiarize yourself with, because to them, Western medicine is kind of foreign. It's uncomfortable sometimes. So given this situation, there was a couple gaps in knowledge that we wanted to address. The first is that a lot of the research we have focuses on a specific community, a specific church, a specific group, a specific mosque even. And because of that, they don't really look at the country as a whole. And so we were trying to conduct a research study where we interviewed people from all across the country, rural, urban, everything. And when they focus on religions, they tend to avoid denominational distinctions. And so the research doesn't really make a difference between, say, a Catholic and a Protestant. It's kind of just this big umbrella term of Christian. But The truth is that they have different beliefs sometimes, and sometimes those different beliefs impact the way they use mental health services. There's no research on Pentecostal Canadian clergy views and experiences, and like we focused on the Pentecostal denomination for like two reasons. The first is that when we interviewed Afro-Caribbean immigrants, there was like an overrepresentation of Pentecostals. The second is because like myself, I kind of have a background in the Pentecostal denomination, and so it was easy for me to kind of build those relationships and recruit participants. Also, Afro-Caribbean research, like it's really outdated. The last studies we saw of their mental health perspectives, at least in this area, were like 20 years ago. And so we don't know if things have changed in that community or not. So basically, what we did was we had two separate studies. The first was to look at the views and experiences of Afro-Caribbean Christians that had used mental health services. And the second was to look at the views and experiences of like clergy, so pastors that were working with these Afro-Caribbeans. And we wanted to ask them, like, what's your approach? What kind of cases have you seen? And how have you, as like a spiritual leader, helped them navigate the whole mental health thing? And then we would put these two together and kind of synthesize our data. So our first study, like I have some demographic data there that I'm not going to go over, but basically this is just the most recent numbers we have on the amount of Afro-Caribbeans that are in the country and how many of them are Christian. And what we do know about their communities is that their faith plays a really big part in how they engage with the world, how they understand the world. And it's a very common theme within their home. So if you look at like qualitative research of Afro-Caribbeans, you'll often talk, or you'll see examples of people talking about how their parents, were like, you should go to church. Or like, if there's an aspect of their life that their parents don't agree with, well, it's like the Bible says you can't do that kind of thing. And this becomes like a common motif in a lot of their experiences. And so we know that religion plays a pivotal role in their lives. We know that there's a disparity between first generation and second generation immigrants. So if you're an Afro-Caribbean immigrant from, a country in the Caribbean, your experience might be a little different than if you were the child of an Afro-Caribbean immigrant. And we also know that they strongly identify as Caribbean as opposed to African and engage in religious contexts that explicitly reinforce ethnic identification and provide psychological and structural space for that. Basically what this means is that when an Afro-Caribbean immigrant comes to Canada, what they're looking for is not just another church. They're looking for a predominantly black church. They're looking for community members that will understand their experiences, understand where they're coming from, understand some of their cultural metaphors. So we recruited 18 participants, all of whom self-identified as Christian and Afro-Caribbean. They had to have seen a mental health professional in the last 3 years, and we documented like the reasons that they went to go see these people. And they had to speak English or French, obviously, because the interviews we were doing were either in English or French. We used a multi-pronged recruitment approach. Now, when you're working with like a community of people that are under-researched, that are a little bit skeptical of medicine, a little bit skeptical of psychiatry, and you go and you say, well, I'm a psychiatric researcher, would you be willing to talk to me? There's a lot of suspicion. And because of that, you have to build relationships with members of the community. So we built a relationship with this newspaper called the Montreal Community Contact. It's like a very popular Afro-Caribbean newspaper. And there's a ton of ads in them for like Haitian businesses and Trinidadian businesses. And so that was kind of our main avenue of recruitment. And then we also reached out to like student associations. So like the Black Student Association of McGill, the Black Student Association of Concordia, and they helped us recruit participants as well. We conducted semi-structured qualitative interviews. Basically what this means is like if I'm interviewing somebody, I have a guide of questions that I need to ask, but I also have the liberty as an interviewer not to follow the script kind of word for word. So if they say something interesting to me, like I have the opportunity to kind of explore that a little more. And this methodology is really useful, especially when you're working with like under-researched communities, because you never really know where the interview is going to take you. Sometimes these interviews, people disclose a lot of really, really personal, sometimes heavy things. And it feels like if you're just kind of rigidly following a script, like it makes them uncomfortable too. And so they were very open to that, and I think like that's the kind of methodology that I would recommend to anybody that was interested in research with underprivileged communities, is to take the semi-structured approach. And to analyze our data, we use thematic analysis. And basically what that means is we interview somebody, we make a transcript of the interview, we take out any identifying information like names or places, anything that might identify them. And then basically what we look for is patterns across the data set. So in the 18 interviews we did, what themes are showing up? What are people saying that correlates with what some of the other participants are saying about their perspectives with mental health care, about their experiences in the Quebec healthcare system, for instance? And the three goals that we had for this study were to explore self-identified barriers and facilitators towards recovery, to elicit their experiences within the official mental health care system, so like think, Quebec hospitals and stuff, and identify whether or not they used alternative treatments. So we had three kind of key themes. I'll go through them. The first was the importance of public and private religious practices and church community for recovery. Public practices meaning they went to church, they participated in like these small groups, they prayed with other religious people. They had private practices. These were like reading the Bible, fasting, meditating, all of that. And all of these practices were described as facilitators, meaning that our participants mentioned that these helped them recover in their mental health struggles. All of these were described positively. The last one there is church community. So they would go to different programs at the church. Now this was described a lot more equivocally. So some people said like the church was a great place for me. I felt like people were supportive, people were helpful, people would listen to me. And then other people said that I can't tell anybody about my struggles at church. Like Christians don't believe that Christians can be depressed. And so I can't tell them about that. This is a quote from one of our participants, and she was like an older lady. So she was in her 60s. And she said, I still have a relationship with God, but I can't tell it to people in my church because they don't believe that Christians can be depressed. And this is the kind of data that we were looking for. Like, is there a relationship between specific theological and religious beliefs and then an approach to dealing with your mental health issue? And because they believe that Christians can't be depressed, well, she felt she couldn't tell other Christians that she was depressed, even if she had a clinical diagnosis. Even if she felt like the church might have been helpful, there was a lot of difficulty for her in disclosing. The second theme was the influence of different aspects of the social cultural environment on stigma and recovery. This is like mainly family and friends, and it's the same kind of relationship. Some people said like my friends were great. I could tell them that I was struggling and they were extremely supportive. Same with family. Other people said that family was actually a barrier to obtaining care. And this is particularly true among our younger participants. And so we had a couple participants that were like CJEP or university age, and some of them still lived at home. And so they wanted to go see a therapist, but the thing about therapy is that it's extremely expensive. And, it's like if you want to go see a therapist, you have to ask your parents to help you out. But you can't tell your parents that you're struggling if they believe that, there's something wrong with you if you have a mental illness. And so those kind of issues stop people from getting the help that they need. Another thing was culture. And I thought that was really interesting that some people would talk about these experiences and then immediately point to their culture. They would say, like, in my culture, we don't talk about that. Or in my home, we don't talk about that. One participant said, in my culture, you have anger. You have either you're happy, you're mad, or you're sad. That's it. 3 emotions. The rest of them is because you didn't do your studies. It's because you didn't eat. It's because, like, other reasons. But, like, feeling guilt, not really guilt. In my culture, it's more shame. If you see a therapist, you must be crazy. Something must be wrong with you. That's my culture. This was also like a college-aged participant. And the third factor, of course, was experiences with racism. This was more common in our older participants, and it often had to do with employment. So they said that people were racist to them when they were going to work, that their bosses didn't treat them the same as white employees, things like that, or that they struggled to find a job, and oftentimes race was a barrier. Now, the third theme for this study was kind of general issues related to the mental health care system and the use of alternative remedies. Most of these are kind of really common across all medical studies. So people had to wait a really long time. People found it difficult to get a referral, to find somebody to talk to. They had equivocal experiences with therapy. So for some people, therapy was really helpful. They felt that their therapist understood them, understood their culture, their religion. But for others, they felt that therapy was kind of a barrier. And 1 or 2 sessions in, they would kind of stop because it was so expensive and it just wasn't working. Mainly, this has to do with the cultural competence of the therapist. So the question is, does my therapist understand my culture? Do they understand my family? Do they understand why I believe the things I believe? Do they understand how those beliefs impact my life? And when the therapist didn't, this led to a lot of issues. I remember one participant, she was in university. She was like, first or second year university student. And she was telling me that her mom wanted to throw her a birthday party, but she was in the middle of conflict with her mom, and so she didn't want to go to this birthday party. And she's talking about it with her therapist, and the therapist says, well, don't go. Because in the therapist's mind, you have to assert your autonomy, you have to be assertive. And she's teaching this client all these things. But for the client, well, she goes, like, in my culture, we don't do that. Like, we don't just disobey our parents. That's going to lead to a big problem. But the therapist couldn't understand it. And that's an example of the kind of cultural conflict. And another example, actually, with family, we compensated all our participants for interviews, and so we would send them like an Amazon gift card. And another participant, also young, also a child to Afro-Caribbean immigrants, and we were going to compensate him by sending the gift card to him, and he was like, just don't send me the gift card to my house because I don't want my parents to know that I'm talking to somebody. And so there's like a culture of fear sometimes with disclosure, and that makes it really hard. One thing that was interesting was that there was like a unanimous feeling that medication was a bad idea, either that it didn't work or that the side effects were just way too harmful. And this was like without exception. Every participant that was prescribed medication either didn't take it or said that they took it and had really bad side effects. And because of that, they sought out alternative remedies, things like Japanese Reiki, like exercise, like dance therapy, and these holistic kind of therapeutic approaches ended up being a lot more effective for them in their perspective. And so this is a quote from a participant that talked about their encounters with a therapist, and they said, "I didn't find that they had my best interests at heart. I didn't find that they were engaged, and it was really just a whole, like, how's the medication?" It was really mechanic. Like, how's the medication? Are you taking the meds? Are you having suicidal thoughts? Okay, well, we'll see you next time. One of the things that's interesting is that this kind of overlaps with some other research we've done in hospitals. And so at the Montreal General, for them to maximize efficiency, they teach their psychiatrists that if you want to be able to be the most efficient psychiatrist in your department, you should have no more than 3 minutes interaction with each patient. And 3 minutes is like nowhere near the kind of time you would need to really understand a patient. But because there's such a stress on the healthcare system, these interactions are becoming more and more common. So that was the first study, and we saw that there was like an overrepresentation of Pentecostals in that first study. And I had a Pentecostal background, and so we were interested in actually interviewing clergy, so the pastors of the people that went to these churches, to think about like, or just ask them like, you know, how do you talk about mental health in your church? What kind of cases have people brought to you? How do you deal with them? And so there's different perspectives on the role of clergy. The theological idea or the religious idea behind a clergy person is that they're meant to be, like the metaphor they use is a shepherd. So the idea of the shepherd is it kind of leads the sheep and kind of guides them where they're supposed to go. And so that's the role. And in immigrant communities, that means that there's a lot of respect and a lot of influence that these religious leaders have, almost to the point where if your religious leader says, you know, don't take medication, they're not going to take it. And vice versa, if your religious leader says you should be going to your appointments, well, people will actually go. And there's also a sociological function, right? And that is that they are highly consequential as far as human behavior. Like humans kind of gravitate sometimes towards leaders, and religious leaders are great examples of that. Now we know that sometimes, especially among immigrant communities, people prefer to see clergy as opposed to their psychiatrist, often because they think that their issues are spiritual and not psychological, and so they're seeking out a spiritual treatment or a spiritual approach, and they frame their distress as being primarily religious in nature. So then the question is, well, what do clergy do when people come to see them? The first is that they recommend usually the adoption of spiritual practices. So they say, well, you need to be praying more. You need to be fasting more. You need to be reading your Bible more. Other times they'll refer them to popular psycho-religious literature. I have like 2 books there that are examples. The first one's on addiction, so people tend to go to religious leaders oftentimes when they're struggling with addictions. The second one is The Bondage Breaker, right? So like overcoming kind of anxiety, bad habits. And both of them, like the idea is like there's a religious solution to this, and you need to walk down that path if you want to get better. Lastly, some of them actually do refer to mental health professionals, but that's a lot less common. So our goal was to talk to different clergy members, and we recruited 29 credentialed clergy with the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, which is just like this group of churches. And they had to have 2 years of ministry experience and experience offering pastoral care or counseling to individuals experiencing distress. And the main objectives of the study were to document their views on mental health, their training, their knowledge of mental health, their experience, their reactions to congregants with mental health issues, and what their experience was like providing pastoral care. So again, there was 3 themes. The first one was that they had a multifactorial understanding of mental illness that included spiritual causes. So they believed that there were biological factors that cause mental illness, that there were social factors. They talked about the importance of the family, they talked about the importance of culture, but they did mention that spirituality was a really, really big, important factor. Some of the younger pastors we talked to were afraid of over-spiritualizing mental health because they were afraid that people would believe that it was exclusively spiritual, so they were like, no, you should go see your doctor, you know, you should go see your therapist. Generally, the pastors did believe in divine healing. They held positive views of healthcare providers, but mixed opinions on medication. So in the first study, we saw that Afro-Caribbeans had a largely negative view of medication. In this study, the religious leaders have a mixed view. So here's a couple quotes. The first pastor said, mental illness is a result of our fallen nature. We get sick in our bodies. Why can't we get sick in our minds? Another pastor, and this was an older pastor, he said, in the 80s, we told people that if they were sick, it's because they had secret sin in their life. And again, there's like this evolution of religious clergy having to learn how to overcome some of those thought patterns. Another person said that as a Pentecostal, it's part of your doctrine that you believe that God heals. And the last quote again talks about how consequential pastors can be. It says, if a pastor said, you must go see your psychiatrist, then some of them would actually listen to us. The second theme was their kind of different pastoral care approaches. Most of them decided to use individual spiritual care. What this means is the pastor would kind of open their office door. The person that was struggling would come in. They would talk about it together. The pastor would pray with them, maybe recommend different parts of the scriptures that they could read or something. A couple pastors mentioned the importance of boundaries. So some, I guess older pastors, this was more common, but even among younger pastors, they wouldn't counsel members of the opposite sex. So female pastors wouldn't counsel men. Male pastors wouldn't counsel women. Other boundaries, these were time boundaries. So a pastor would say, I'll talk to you for an hour, but that's it. After that, I think I'm going to refer you to somebody, or that's the extent of my help for you. A lot of them did make use of referral, and pastors that worked in churches with lots of money actually would subsidize the cost of counseling for some people. Sometimes they would hire counselors to work inside the church, or they would pay for a specific number of sessions. And they used church-based curricula, which basically means there was a program, a 12-step program or something like that ran in the church. And so if you came to them with an issue, they would send you to the 12-step program and hope that would help you. A couple quotes to talk about these. One pastor said that it begins and ends with prayer. And my role is to remind them of what the scriptures say. That's my job. Another pastor who was talking about boundaries, he said, any tool that I have that's helpful or beneficial for you in a spiritual capacity or a pastoral capacity, by 6 sessions, you have every tool that I have to give you. The last pastor said, pastors aren't trained to be counselors and therapists, and we need to be aware of how much damage we can do if we don't have those skills and training. And so there's a little bit of humility there about the confines of pastoral training and just how far they can go. And generally speaking, they were interested in their congregants getting better. It's just that they didn't really have all the resources themselves. The third and final theme from the second study was that there were mixed levels of training and ongoing support. So mental health training didn't really exist when pastors were being trained in the 80s, but younger pastors told us that they had to do mental health first aid training in order to graduate. And I thought that was interesting, which basically means that there's some general knowledge, some exposure that they have to this while they're training now that they didn't have, and older pastors talked about that. Because of that, actually, a lot of them sought out some of their own training, and there was 6 or 7 of the 29 people that we interviewed that ended up becoming therapists themselves. A lot of their supports were contingent on geography. So rural pastors struggled a lot. There was no one really to refer their congregants to. Urban pastors had a bit of an easier time, right? So they would give if you're in a bigger city, it's a lot easier to get resources. And whenever they wanted supports from their districts, a lot of this was contingent on budget. So if there was money, it's a lot easier to offer resources than if there was no money at all. And because of that, there was also a reluctance to use district services. So a district is kind of like an umbrella over a bunch of churches. But the issue is that if you as a pastor go to your district and say, I'm struggling or I'm having this issue, there's a fear that maybe, they won't respect confidentiality, or they might share some of that information to somebody else, or that might hurt your reputation. And because of that, they didn't really disclose their issues to their districts. But there was peer and family support. And peer and family support was a huge facilitator for the pastors. One pastor said, between weddings and funerals, there just seemed to be a vacuum of just trust God, open the Bible, see what happens. And that's basically all you got. Another pastor who works in a rural community said, I think we have a clinician who comes once or twice a month, or once a month or something, or every 2 weeks. And again, if you're working with a bunch of people, there's just no help, no resources for you. Another person said, you have to go talk to somebody to get a number, to get approval, which everybody's going to know. And so again, there's fear of professional consequences there, and because of that, they don't reach out for help. As far as where the samples overlap and diverge, there's a couple areas of overlap. Both samples shared a spiritual understanding of mental health. that there were spiritual causes potentially, and because of that, potentially spiritual solutions. Both samples emphasized religious practices like prayer and reading the scriptures. Both samples emphasized integrating spirituality into mental health care, which means that for an Afro-Caribbean Christian, if they're going to see a therapist, they would prefer that that therapist is Christian or at least understands their Christian faith. And for a clergy person, if they're going to refer somebody, they want to refer somebody to a therapist that is Christian or, again, understands the Christian faith. And the biggest deterrent for both groups was stigma. Basically, this idea of, like, I can't tell anybody what I'm going through. And that kind of was a huge barrier for both Afro-Caribbean Christians that wanted help and the pastors that are supposed to be helping them. They did diverge in a couple areas. The first was their attitudes regarding medication, right? So Afro-Caribbeans were a lot more distrusting of medication than the clergy. And the church, like the pastors mentioned that they use church-based programs and curricula, but the Afro-Caribbean Christians that we interviewed, that's not really their thing. And they made it pretty clear that even though those programs were on offer to them, they weren't exactly interested, often because of that fear of having to disclose their issues to somebody. So there's a couple of key findings. Again, I mentioned earlier that the vast majority of sicknesses are handled in the popular domain, and the family-patient relationship is the most consequential. If you look at the diagram on the side, basically that's like breaking down the popular sector. And so in the middle, you have the individual. Outside of that, there's their family, and then the social nexus and the wider community. And as stigmatizing attitudes exist on the outside, they tend to drift inwards. So if there's a negative attitude about mental health in the church, that tends to force its way into the family, and eventually down to the individual, who tends to stigmatize their own thoughts, and it's like, something must be wrong with me, I must have a problem. And because of that, there's inhibited disclosure that moves outwards through the popular sector. So because of these attitudes moving inwards, the individual doesn't tell their family. The family starts to reinforce the idea that we can't tell the wider community, and so on and so forth. And so it's like the problem from this perspective kind of starts at the wider community level. With regards to the professional sector, it says that there's a much more favorable perspective in study 2. So clergy are a lot more in favor of therapists and psychiatrists than the Afro-Caribbeans. There's an opportunity to integrate the professional sector or integrate faith into the professional sector. And the way you do that is by having religiously trained therapists, right? So it's a lot more beneficial for a Muslim to go see a Muslim therapist and for a Christian to go see a Christian therapist in order that their therapist understands their perspectives and their background. The second point there is that cultural and religious competence are deterrents. So if the therapist themselves does not understand the culture of the client, that therapeutic relationship probably is not going to work. And for many people, it's a huge barrier to seeking out help because no one understands them. With regards to the folk sector, I mentioned private and public religious practices, but this study really reiterated the importance of spiritual care. And so pastors talking to their congregants kind of one-on-one about their issues ended up being a facilitator of recovery for some people. But again, in the Afro-Caribbean community, stigma was such a huge barrier. A couple takeaways. So I mentioned studies that happened 20 years ago. Little has changed as far as the perspectives of Afro-Caribbeans. They were distrustful of medication in those studies 20 years ago. They were reluctant to use professional services, and that still seems to be the case. Pentecostal Canadian clergy have a multivariate etiology of mental illness, and etiology is just a medical term we use to talk about causes. So they believe that there's a whole variety of causes for mental illness, but there is a strong emphasis on spirituality. Another key takeaway is that services for these communities should integrate religion. As far as the future, there is this idea that the discipline of psychiatry and religion are kind of hostile to each other. There's one study that showed that psychiatrists have the lowest rates of religion relative to any other medical discipline. But for me, a study like this is really hopeful because there seems to be opportunities for allyship. Psychiatrists can include clergy in some of their treatments. And McGill started doing that. There's a cultural consultation clinic where the psychiatrists that work there now, they'll have, pastors and imams, rabbis sometimes come in to help with clients that are extremely religious. And this has been very effective for them. There's the importance of cultural competence. I think there are pretty good opportunities to raise mental health awareness in the denominations that we've interviewed. There's an openness to it. There's an admission that maybe, pastors don't have all the answers and all the answers aren't necessarily spiritual. And with regards to training and anti-stigma, there's open doors, and I think a talk like this might be good. If there are some of you that are interested in religion or mental health or pursuing, medical research eventually, like these are very important things, and the government's actually excited to invest in these projects, which is kind of exciting for us as researchers. A couple limitations of the study. The first is generalizability. Like, can I take these findings and say that they're the same for, a group of Muslims, and are they going to be the same for a group of Jewish believers? The answer is obviously no, and we did conduct research on other religious groups as well, and we see a lot of the same themes. I think one of the interesting things was that in the other groups, the stigma fear actually had to do with marriageability, because there's more of a tendency, I guess, in those communities to marry within the faith. And so people that we interviewed said, like, my biggest fear about being somebody with psychosis or somebody with depression is that no one's going to want to marry me. And that was a very common issue. Another generalizability issue is, could we say that it's going to be the same for, like, Catholics or Baptists? I don't know. We haven't done that work yet. One of the issues is social acceptability. So, like, sometimes when you interview somebody and they know that, whatever they say to you is going to be part of some paper or some publication, they tend to sometimes frame themselves as better than they actually are, and we all tend to do this. And so there's this potential that could bias some of their answers. We didn't specify categories of illness, so, maybe churches have something to offer people with depression that they can't offer to someone with psychosis, for instance. But we didn't really focus on that. The other issue we had was sub-study fit and internal validity. So is it fair to pick Afro-Caribbean Christians and match them up with Pentecostal clergy? Does that hurt the internal validity of the project? Maybe they're not the best fits for one another. So again, like, these are all future areas of research. The last thing I wanted to talk about, and I probably think it's like the most important, is positionality. So when you're working in research, one of the things that they always ask you is, where do you fit as a researcher in relation to the thing that you're researching? And so the question for me is like, well, where do I fit as a researcher relative to, Pentecostal churches and Afro-Caribbean Christians? And for me, like, I'm not Afro-Caribbean, and so I was an outsider to the community doing the research. But I am a Pentecostal. That picture at the top right over there is my church that I go to. And I think that the benefit of being an insider to a religious community and researching that community is that when they use some of this religious language, you kind of understand it a little better than somebody from the outside. The issue, of course, is that there's the potential for bias. And so in research, one of the ways that you kind of mitigate the risk of bias is something called triangulation. So I'll do an interview, and then my colleague will do an interview, and then we'll both kind of split the 29 participants. And when we're doing our analysis to look over the data, I'll conduct an independent analysis, they'll conduct an independent analysis, my supervisor will conduct an independent analysis, and if we're all reaching the same conclusions, well, that's how we mitigate the risk of bias. It's not like a perfect science or anything, but it is kind of our approach to dealing with that. Ahmad mentioned earlier that I was a student at Dawson. When I came here, I was in, like, pure and applied, and, like, I skipped a lot of class, and so I didn't do very well. And then I eventually switched to econ, and I still skipped a lot of class and didn't do very well. And so by the time I got to university, like, I went to theology because I had a background in religion, but also because they were the only program that would probably take me, and it was easy to get in. And so when I did that, I realized at that point that I was interested in psychology, so I started taking psych classes, and I applied to transfer, and I didn't get in. And then another semester went by, and I applied to transfer again. I still didn't get in. And I applied and failed like 3 times. And then when I finally got in, I had done all these theology classes that I was like, I'm just going to make this a second major because I had done all these classes anyway. And so by the end of my degree, I had a full major in theology and a full major in psych. And then eventually, like, some of you guys will notice this, but like when you finish high school, there's this question of like, what's next? And then you'll go through CJEP, and at the end of that, there's going to be this question of, well, what's next? And then you'll do your undergrad, and it's the same thing. And I didn't know what I was going to do, and I kind of emailed this professor, and I was like, I have a background in theology, I have a background in psych, I see that you're doing research in religion and mental health, could I come and volunteer? Like, just to do a couple, like, I don't know, help you out with a project or whatever. And I met him, and he eventually was like, actually, we have an opening for a master's student, would you be interested? And that's how I kind of started doing all this stuff. And all that to say, like, your academic trajectory is going to be very different from mine, but each of the experiences you have can be extremely valuable. Even while you're here at CJEP, even while you might not, like, have it all figured out, that's totally okay. And what made me a good fit for this research wasn't that I had like the grades or the academic aptitudes or anything like that. It was just my upbringing, my background, my culture, and it made it so that I had something unique to offer. And I think like that could be true for any one of you that might be interested in research or whatever career it is you're interested in. Like don't sell yourself short. Ahmad asked me if I had like any tips for people that were kind of thinking about university and next steps in their life. The first one is like start early and don't be afraid to like write a cold email to somebody that you've never met before, introducing yourself. When I emailed my supervisor, like I misspelled his last name. And so when he responded to me, he had to like correct me being like, that's not my last name. And those things will happen. You'll make mistakes and it's okay. People are generally forgiving. I think there is a idea or a perception that like academia is a little cutthroat and people are cold. Some people are, but some people aren't. And there's some really good people out there. And so I'd encourage you to like reach out. Even now as a CCHEP student, like if you're interested in research, start reading, start writing, reach out to people, write in like different, participate in student associations, and all those things are really helpful. The other one I'd say is like focus on relationships. This is huge. For me, like I told you earlier, I was skipping a lot of class in CCHEP, but they had this rule in one of my research methods classes that like if you skip more than 6 times, you fail. And so I kind of didn't care sometimes, and I would skip and fail. Like I was just like, whatever. But my teacher emailed me being like, hey, you're at 5 like absences. Like, don't miss a 6th one. And that was Ahmad, actually. And he emailed me being like, hey, like, don't skip another class because you might fail. And I don't know, I was a bit of a people pleaser, so I was like, okay, well, now I can't skip because like he notices that I skip. So I got to talking to him, and we were both interested at the time in like economics and reading. And that relationship developed, and now here I am, talking at this conference again because of that relationship. And so sometimes, if you have like a connection with a teacher or whatever, like invest in it because it could be really rewarding for you down the line. My relationship with my supervisor, for instance, like he was interested in religion and mental health, and I didn't even ask to go to grad school. He kind of offered it to me. And sometimes those doors will open for you, and they'll take you by surprise. But don't be afraid to like reach out, to take initiative, and focus on those relationships. The other one, and this is the big one, I would say, is like avoid the comparison trap. I have a quote here from Brene Brown, and she's a researcher and a therapist. And she says, comparison's the crush of conformity from one side and competition from the other. It's trying to simultaneously fit in and stand out. And I get it. Like, I was in Dawson too, and like, for me, coming out of high school was like, yeah, I went to Dawson, but my friends went to Mary, and they made this whole big deal about how they went to Marianopolis, and it's a better school than Dawson or whatever. And you kind of feel down on yourself. And then you get to Concordia, and then all your other friends are like, oh, well, we got into McGill. And you're like, okay, whatever. And there's just this constant temptation to compare yourself to other people as far as academics. And I was in school, and then this guy starts a business, and that guy owns a car, and I don't have any of that. Like, it's not worth it. Eventually, life has a way of kind of figuring itself out. And I think, like, one thing I needed to hear when I was in CJEP, and I hope you guys take this away, is, like, genuinely, you're going to be okay. Things are going to work out. You'll be fine. Things will fall into place. There's no need to stress about it. You will have what you need when you need it. So you're going to be all right. Okay? Don't beat yourselves up. I got my email there. If you're interested in, like, research, or if you're thinking about a career in academia and you have questions or anything at all, something more personal you want to talk about, I'd be happy to help with whatever I have to offer. So, yeah, thanks for listening.
I really enjoyed the talk. I thought it was incredibly insightful. What I wanted to ask is, so this is like kind of just like a synthesis of your general findings. If I heard correctly, you did do other studies on other denominations. Do you mind like sharing some of the results of the other studies that you conducted, and maybe some of the differences between the Pentecostal denomination and some other denominations?
Yeah, so we haven't really done a study with another denomination yet. We're actually in the process of doing it. The only other studies we've done as far as like religious believers were about Haredi Jews and kind of Middle Eastern Muslim immigrants. And I would say that the big kind of difference had to do with like what I mentioned earlier with marriageability. Like there was such a fear among people that had mental illness in different communities of like, will I find somebody that's going to love me and be willing to settle down with me? Because I think there's such a strong cultural emphasis in some of those religions on marriage and on family. And I don't know, my assumption is that maybe parents put some of that pressure on them. So I think that was a big one. Another one, and this had to do with the Haredi Jewish community, is that they're such a small community. So it was really, really, really hard for them to find professionals that understood their faith, that understood their background. And because of that, there was a greater reluctance to engage with professionals from outside their communities. So yeah, those are kind of the main differences.
Thank you. I have a question. You mentioned that you compensated the participants.
Yeah.
Could you tell us the kind of justification behind that, and also if there are any kind of considerations or potential disadvantages to doing that?
Yeah, so the main thing, that the idea is that you're compensating them for their time and their willingness to participate, not for what it is they're going to quote unquote give you. So there's a little bit of distinction you have to make. There is a downside, and that's sometimes that, like, initially you screen your participants. So you conduct, like, you give them a little survey. You say, well, do you speak English or French? Have you seen a mental health professional in the last 3 years? And then they check that off and give it to you. Now, somebody can lie about it, and we did have that experience, which is what I would say is the main downside, is that when you're offering compensation, sometimes people will try to, get paid. And so there's one guy I interviewed, and he came on, and he had, like, an accent that was, like, way, way off. And I noticed that, but I was like, whatever. His camera was off during the interview, so I didn't bother asking. And then I kept, like, as soon as I could tell something was off, I insisted on him telling me a little bit more about his family, his background, his culture. And he kind of got frustrated. He's like, why do you keep asking me about my family? And then he hung up and left. And I was like, okay. But basically, that's the risk. Is like every time you're compensating participants, sometimes people, if there's like money on offer, will try to participate even if they don't meet the criteria.
Okay, so what was like a major like block like that you guys had to overcome in this study?
Oh, a major block. I think the big one was recruitment. Like, for the first study, we recruited 18 participants, and it took us like 6 months, just because there was such a strong unwillingness to participate. And then when we did the clergy study, like, we recruited 30 people in 1 month. And again, I think that reflects like the attitudes people have about talking about mental health. And even if you're getting paid sometimes, like, if there's this cultural belief that you shouldn't be talking about these things, people just won't do it. Yeah.
There is a story I want to share with you. It's funny and insightful at the same time. And talking about when you were speaking about the pastors and the kind of the divide that we have between mental health professionals and the religion. There's a story that once somebody goes to the priest and says, "When I'm praying, is it okay to smoke?" And the priest is outraged and like, "No, of course not. You're praying. How can you smoke during prayer?" And then in another occasion, the guy goes up and says, "Father, when I'm smoking, can I also pray?" So just switching this side. And the priest is like, "Of course, it's always a good idea to pray, even when you're smoking." So sometimes it's just a matter of just the way you frame things. So in this case, you could, if it comes across as a substitute, that okay, it's either going to the religious authority or going to mental health, then they might, each side might push back on the other side and say, "No, I'm the only authority." Whereas if it's more like a compliment, that okay, if I'm going to the other side, can I also integrate this other knowledge? Is that okay? So I think that was also part of what you're building toward, and you said that there is hope in that integration. Any other questions or comments? If you could also tell us, you also have some experience with alcohol addiction, working with that. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that like any experience you have can be useful in research. So when I was, this was like near the end of my undergrad, I worked at a community center, and it was kind of like housing/addiction recovery. And a lot of them were alcoholics, a lot of them were drug addicts. And basically I worked as like a support worker. And my job was there to make sure that they would take their meals on time, that they would take their medication on time, that if they needed access to local services, that I could refer them to the right people. And again, when it came time for me to talk to these immigrants and minorities as like a graduate student, I had already developed the kind of listening skills needed, and that comes from those like early formative experiences. And so, again, it's like another encouragement. Like if you have like an interest in something, even if it's not concrete and fully fleshed out, like I would encourage you to pursue it. Because it may not be useful right away, but it'll be useful, down the line. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. And also, I also want to tell you some important and useful piece of information. More than 50% of students change their programs within their first year of university. Some of you have already changed your program. Justin changed during Dawson and also later. It's totally fine. Like he was in pure and applied, then he was a commerce student, then he went to theology, psychology. So if you basically don't be disappointed after 1 year or two, if you feel like you're not interested in what you're doing, it's not a dead end. It's a new discovery, and it's never late. Although it's always better to make those transitions sooner than later, just to minimize the costs. All right, guys, let's give a round of applause to Justin. Thanks a lot for your time.
Yeah, thank you.